While the last video was almost unequivocally critical of the written constitution, it does have its uses. In keeping with the example of the United States particularly, it functions as a cornerstone in the minds of its citizens for the values of the nation. This is an advantage that must not be understated for its ability to stop the subversion of such values by seditious forces, though it is not infallible. The example used prior of the First and Second Amendments are generally the most prominent in the national dialogue and the imaginations of the US citizens, so they are more immune than most, but even they have likely already strayed from the common conception of the protections they represent. In the case of the First Amendment, the notion of a society free to speak its mind is highly valuable in the search for the most effective policy, among other reasons of course. However, a problem arises in that the value of free speech is not synonymous with the legal requirements of such. In a legal sense, one is only free from government interference in most forms of speech. Relevant in an age of widespread centralised censorship, but less so when most forms of speech travel via the medium of a private company's property, both intellectual and otherwise. Ergo, the First Amendment at time of writing does nothing to protect an individual from private censorship. A man may speak his mind on social media and have the comment removed by the company. He might claim that his free speech is being infringed upon, while the company replies that free speech doesn't necessitate the use of their platform to say it, and both will be, strictly speaking, correct. That is a problem. The Second Amendment, meanwhile, has a merit all its own in its denial of the state's ability to totally control its populace. While of course not the cause of the rebellious and distrustful attitude of many US citizens to government, so distant from the individual citizens, it will have certainly contributed to the maintenance of it. As discussed previously, there have been a number of creeping limitations on this right, but ultimately this has little effect on the psychological impact of the Second Amendment, and something sorely lacking here in the UK. Ours is a culture which, despite having very little trust in government and politicians, has very little basis for an adversarial relationship. Instead, we are largely at the mercy of their dictates. This advantage falls through somewhat when it comes to the amendments that are still fairly well known, but less often discussed, such as the 8th, which prescribes cruel and unusual punishment. While it would be too simplistic to simply point out that this is the same country with the highest nominal and per capita incarceration rate, it does certainly have a certain irony about it. The more interesting issue is that of the Guantanamo Bay detention facility, because despite being located on ground administered by the US government, it is sovereign Cuban territory, and so seems to put the activities practiced within the camp into a relative legal grey area. Politically, the whole issue is another dividing line between many areas of the US, to a stronger degree than that of the First and Second Amendments. This takes the form of disagreement on the legitimacy of both the death penalty in a domestic context and the use of torture against enemy combatants in an international context. Granted, the former doesn't necessarily qualify as cruel and unusual, but it somewhat illustrates the point that on the issue of punishment in general, there is not the same unity of values that may be found on owning firearms or freedom of speech in principle that might be drawn from the Constitution. So with that said, what would be a better option? Let us take an example. Say a controversial figure is removed from Twitter or another such large social media platform for supporting ideas that are far outside of the Overton window, and considered contemporarily unacceptable. The individual appeals the decision all the way to the sovereign adjudicator, claiming that within the context of modern discourse, being removed from this platform is akin to forced removal from the public square, an action which would be considered unconstitutional. And so, he argues, these definitions must update to the new realities of discourse. How then is this conflict to be resolved? As stated in the last video, sovereignty cannot rest in an inert form, because the essence of sovereignty is to be the final authority in resolving disputes, which necessitates the ability to interpret the nuances of the individual dispute at hand. Ergo, while this alone does not dismantle the notion of a constitution, it does make the power to interpret the constitution a deeply political one, as this itself grants sovereignty in effect. Therefore, if a democratic system is the goal, it would be a sham without either election of the interpreter of the Constitution directly by the demos, or determination by the demos directly. This may take the form of an elected judiciary, or a transfer of this power to an existing elected entity. In this way, the interpretation of the Constitution may not deviate too far from the common understanding, depending on the number of other powers held by the same entity, and their relative importance. However, this still means that it is possible, under the predominant systems of representative democracy here in the West, that the interpretation selected may be out of sync with the public's view of the issues. This could happen in a number of ways, perhaps through incentives to the individual or office interpreting the document differing drastically with the incentives of the demos, perhaps through low turnout giving undue power to a particularly motivated subset of the electorate, or perhaps simply through corruption. And while not a flaw in itself, this this method does do away with the pretense that an otherwise uninterested populace can have the integrity of the state remain intact with such a document. Returning to the example proposed, if a limited term system were to be used, then there is the risk that, to avoid the increased regulation, the company in question promises favours to the adjudicator. This would be tempting because the individual or individuals adjudicating the case are incentivised to look beyond their term for their own life, but only as far as the end of their term for the good of the nation. Therefore, depending on the risk involved with indulging the requested whim, a strong moral character will be required in all adjudicators for an honest decision reflective of the demos to be made. As with other issues, a more democratised system runs the risk of becoming simply a new vessel for ideologues of various sort to pick up each issue with only an ideological lens to navigate. If it simply becomes a shouting match between socialists looking to increase the government control over enterprise versus libertarians and free market liberals looking to limit such, then the point is perhaps missed. Worse still, with sides led by these groups, there is the risk that members of the electorate less ideologically committed to be dissuaded by the level of discourse typical to ideological flashpoints. This, of course, strengthens both factions, as their influence on the outcome is thus less diluted. And on top of all this, how can an electorate, and by extension their representatives, if applicable, with such minimal legal training be expected to resolve complex matters with such wide implications for the function of the country? In much the same way as they do with every other issue, particularly in the field of economics, where the implications of decisions are far less comprehensively understood by their proponents. If only there was a way that we could ensure that the interpreter of the Constitution could have their own interests aligned with the long-term prospering of the nation, with ready access to experts in the field, but with a conscious ear to the desires of the demos. If only.